Welcome to all to our webinar on legal approaches to reduce demand for human trafficking. Thanks for joining us today. First, allow me to express my gratitude to IOM Switzerland for co-hosting this webinar in the framework of the Swiss Week of Action Against Human Trafficking. Nearly everything we consume, from the clothes we wear to the batteries in our cell phones to the food we eat, probably has some forced labor and exploitation hidden somewhere inside its production. Many of us, including the businesses who make the products we buy, have no idea when or where the exploitation occurs, and it's growing every single day. We need to make politicians aware and vigorously nudge them to deal with the demand side of human trafficking. We must switch from combating human trafficking in a piecemeal approach, including criminal prosecution, case by case, and to use a global approach to diminish demand. According to Kevin Hyland, first independent anti-slavery commissioner for the UK government, and Irish member of the Council of Europe Independent Group of Experts for Trafficking, GRETA, there is only one chance in 2,150 for a human trafficking perpetrator to be convicted. For effectively preventing trafficking in persons, we need legal instruments at the domestic, regional, and universal level to create equitable and sustainable public procurement. Public procurement shall lead the way for the private sector. On our website, www.adlaudato.org, we have video recordings of a series of webinars since October 2020. Two webinars dealt with demand as root cause for human trafficking. A video on the 13th of April dealt with sex trafficking and prostitution. A second video on the 20th of April covers the importance of supply chain control by producers and the role of consumers. You are invited to watch those videos with subtitles in 7 languages and download transcripts and handouts. The first speaker today shall be Mrs. Claire Potovesi, Deputy Chief of Mission of the IOM Coordination Office for Switzerland and Liechtenstein, based in Bern. The next speaker will be Brian Islin, founder of the Geneva-based Slave Free Trade, a non-profit organization working on leveraging blockchain to rid the world of slave labor and reducing the driving force for all forms of human trafficking. He has 30 years of experience in the fight against human trafficking at the international level. We are fortunate to have Judge Mark Steiner as a third speaker. He is also an expert in legal approaches to reduce human trafficking. Since 2007, he is a judge at the Swiss Federal Administrative Court, where his research focuses on the legal implications of the inclusion of environmental and social policies in public procurement practices. He is one of 4 co-authors of the standard reference work on the practice of public procurement in Switzerland. Finally, we are very grateful to have John Anthony Mccarty as our 4th speaker. After a successful career as a lawyer in Australia, Queen's Counsel at the New South Wales Bar, and a barrister in Sydney, he was Australian ambassador to the Holy See from 2012 to 2016, and he is now chair of the Catholic Archdiocese of Sydney Anti-Slavery Task Force executive team. His pioneering work of monitoring supply chains and procurement should be an example of best practices beyond Australia. And now, Mrs. Claire Potovesi, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Professor Dr. Vete and the Order of Malta for the invitation today. Dear participants, it's really a great pleasure to address all of you for these welcome remarks and to start this webinar. I am Claire Potovesi and Deputy Chief of Mission at IOM, International Organization for Migration Office in Bern, covering Switzerland and Liechtenstein. In our work, we are fighting human trafficking. It's one of our priority, and we've been working on this for almost a decade. We collaborate with a number of committed partner organizations, such as the Order of Malta, in this area of work. Let me underscore that without the ongoing engagement and support of many other partner organizations in Switzerland, like the Swiss Federal Police, the Swiss Federal Department of Foreign Affairs, the NGO FITS or Cœur des Grottes, Act 212, ASTRE, the platform TRAIT, etc. Without all these partners in Switzerland, we would not be able to plan such a series of events, such as the counter-trafficking weeks, around the date of the 18th of October, which is the European Day Against Human Trafficking. As part of this 5th edition of the Action Week Switzerland Against Human Trafficking, IOM Bern has coordinated 24 different events that are held throughout the month of October all over Switzerland, taking place in 8 different cantons and online, like today, to raise awareness on this issue and to better understand this crime and violation of human rights. Indeed, Switzerland is not exempt from this crime. Here too, we find victims of human trafficking, men, women, transgender people, and children who are sold into prostitution and exploited as labor force. They are lured by false promises for better life, new opportunities, freedom, and prosperity abroad. And every year, around 500 victims are assisted by the network of partners in Switzerland. And this is only the top of the iceberg. We know that there are many victims that are never identified as such. Since 2012, IOM Bern has contributed to awareness raising and prevention through various activities, reaching several thousand people in Switzerland to date. In addition to the general public, the awareness raising campaign also focuses on very specific professional groups who might be in the position to recognize suspicious situation and identify potential victims. And this year, as a special focus for this edition of the counter-trafficking weeks, we have chosen trafficking for the purpose of labor exploitation. In this context, it is particularly important to cooperate with relevant actors in the labor market, such as inspectors, employers, and trade unions. Another important side of the fight against human trafficking is, of course, law enforcement. Politicians and prosecutors act as another key target group to achieve better identification and support for victims of human trafficking. Therefore, it is indispensable to have discussion on the criminal offense of labor exploitation, on the issue of undeclared work and precarious working conditions, as well as professional exchanges between public prosecutor. We are proud to have a very varied agenda for these action weeks with many different events, workshops, webinars, film evening, production of podcasts, street action, etc., including this very broad and international webinar tonight to mark the European Day Against Human Trafficking in Switzerland. IOM Bern is organizing an event in Zurich on the 25th of October to inform trade unions about human trafficking for the purpose of labor exploitation and to launch a reflection on the role that trade union can play to support victims of human trafficking. Today, the focus of this webinar is on the demand side of human trafficking. In this context, human trafficking must be considered as its market system in which the goods are human beings and these goods and demand are dynamically matched. An approach to eradicating human trafficking requires measures that target drivers of migration and trafficking in country of origin. This includes the poverty, gender inequality, violence against women, lack of education and employment opportunities, corruption, climate change, state oppression, and civil wars. So all this has to be taken into consideration because these are the drivers that push people out of their country and in a vulnerable situation for exploitation. It is a multifaceted problem where the action of governments and the international community is required. Intervention needs to take place in countries of origin, in countries of transit, and in countries of destination, so as to address the demand for services and cheap labor. In order to change demand and customer behavior in the long term, educational, social, and cultural measures must be taken. One of the most important determinants of the profitability of the trafficking market is the consumer. A consumer who demands cheap goods, services, and commercial services has a key role to play. It is therefore crucial that this consumer becomes aware of the impact of their consumption pattern and behavior. Public opinion through social media holds the power to change things, as we know. Public opinion can help setting norms and ethical standards for employers and businesses that ultimately lead to the eradication of human trafficking for labor exploitation. The Swiss Development and Cooperation Agency invested in an IOM flagship initiative, which is called IRIS. It is a global multi-stakeholder initiative that supports governments, civil society, and the private sector and recruiters to establish ethical recruitment as a norm in cross-border labor migration. This can be also a great tool to prevent the exploitation and human trafficking. Another approach in terms of tackling the demand created by employers and third parties could focus on increasing costs and risks for trafficker. Sometimes we think it's just too easy for the trafficking to have this very profitable business with human beings because they don't have so many threats of being caught and being punished. This would then reduce the profitability of the market. In addition to the social challenges mentioned above, legislative measure can also be very important. These possible measures are the focus of today's discussion, and I'm very much look forward to a lively discussion. And I would like to thank again Dr. Bötte and the Order of Malta for their commitment and dedication to be active in this field and for their support. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Potovesi, for this very insightful introduction. Indeed, you mentioned those push factors, you mentioned those opportunities for public opinion to pressure authorities and businesses. I think all of this is very good, and definitely we will continue our collaboration with IOM and with you personally. Now I have the pleasure to ask our friend Brian Iselin to take the floor. Brian, we're looking forward to listening to your always interesting intervention. You have the floor.
Thanks very much, Michelle, for the kind invitation to be here again talking demand. I will try and live up to your expectations of being entertaining. So ever since I was a counter-narcotics agent more than 20 years ago, I've been applying the lessons learned from tackling illicit drugs to other crime types. And it's on that basis, since 2004, 17 years, I've been advocating for demand-side approaches to modern slavery. Although I have to admit that back then we weren't even using this umbrella term, modern slavery. That's a much more recent phenomenon. Anyway, in demand-side advocacy, law and policy plays an important potential role, and both in a civil and a criminal context. You'll probably be surprised by me saying civil, but I'll address that a little bit later and you'll understand what I'm talking about. To be clear, I'm not talking about demand-side interventions on trafficking for sexual exploitation. It's clear after decades of experimentation that demand-side measures are the only thing that work in that sector. Tonight, I'm talking about the area of modern slavery and supply chains, so including trafficking, servitude, forced and child labor. So let's be in no doubt what the principle of criminal liability actually says about modern slavery in supply chains, because whenever I talk to businesses, they principally just duck and weave. Now, a company either doesn't know if there is modern slavery in their chain, in which case they're potentially criminally negligent, or they do know and they're just plain criminal. It is a dichotomy. It is binary. And this very obvious dichotomy is completely lost on most people, especially companies, and it gives companies the benefit of the doubt in a way that no other criminal would ever get. What is not happening is any kind of enforcement of this criminal liability. And I mean, there are a lot of reasons for this. It's partly because laws don't exist to apply criminal liability to companies extraterritorially for modern slavery in their supply chains. It's partly because no enforcement resources are allocated to enforce this liability from state agencies. There has not been a single successful criminal case anywhere in the world brought against a company for modern slavery in their supply chain. And partly also because there's actually no political appetite to take on businesses, especially big businesses. There's no political appetite to make this a matter for criminal enforcement. What has been applied, but in a rather, let's say, ad hoc manner, is actually trade sanctions. Witness the US Customs blocking the import of surgical gloves from the Malaysian company Top Glove. You've probably all heard about this case because of allegations of forced labor in their business. The same too with recent trade sanctions in the US and Europe against companies that use cotton picked under forced labor conditions in the Xinjiang province of China. It's not clear that any of these sanctions have actually changed business behavior, though. We'll only be able to really tell that in the long run. On balance, what we might expect, though, from this is actually more obfuscation in supply chains, simply to avoid liability. So the companies that have a supply chain that goes back to Xinjiang, they'll add layers. They'll add layers in the middle that become their excuse for not doing anything. But in any case, whether hugely effective or only a little bit, trade sanctions are one way of disincentivizing, using behavioral economics, disincentivizing business complicity in human rights abuses in their business and supply chains. But sanctions are not criminal law. The criminal law is not being used or applied to police modern slavery and supply chains. So that simple fact brings me on to the next thing I want to talk about here. What legal responses could be adopted by the state to bring about more focus on modern slavery and supply chains? I want to talk firstly about public procurement as a demand-side mechanism. One of the greatest demand-side levers that we can pull on modern slavery and supply chains is public procurement. And why? There's one very simple reason. Public spending in the OECD alone is worth 9 trillion euros a year. If even a minuscule percentage of that could become ethical purchasing, we have an enormous force for good by states to incentivize businesses to do better. Now, I won't talk too much about this because I know Mark wants to talk about it from a legal standpoint, but I want to just share an idea about it briefly from a corporate standpoint. Now, with one of my other hats and for my sins, I've worked a long time on public procurement tenders, that is bidding for contracts from government and suprastate organizations. And I can tell you one thing with absolute certainty. When a new evaluation grid, this is the grid how bids are scored, comes out with new conditions, every company bidding for those tenders gears up to be able to eke every single last point out of that scoring. If gender is added, they treat gender. If climate action gets more points, more effort is spent on climate actions. If modern slavery or human rights were to be added, companies will absolutely start doing what it takes to squeeze every last point out of it. Public tendering, let's be clear, it's a cutthroat, hugely competitive business. Contract award decisions often come down to 1 point. I've won and lost tenders by 1 point. And we all know there's no prize for second best. And when losing, the bid managers just downs a whiskey and starts all over again, making sure that next time they get every point they can. So if they lost because they didn't do enough on human rights, because human rights is now part of the grid, next time they'll fix it. And they'll win a higher percentage of tenders as a result. So they actually have a very personal vested interest in making sure their company can comply because their job is on the line. If they're not winning those tenders, their job is finished. An example of a fairly simple application of this approach is the inclusion of a reasonable number of points for human rights due diligence in the evaluation grids. And I say reasonably high because it doesn't have to actually be very high at all. Even a few points, like I say, with 1 point difference, you can lose a tender. Every few points will trigger improved compliance. From my bidding experience, points, anywhere points between 5 and 10 for anything makes it a top priority. 5 to 10 points in the evaluation grid from public procurement agencies has the potential to be an absolute game changer as a demand-side intervention against modern slavery. Evaluation grids, interestingly, almost never require a legislative change. Often, they normally just demand a policy tweak. So in the UK recently, for example, the Cabinet, I think 3 months ago, the Cabinet Office simply took a decision to order that 10% of the evaluation for all public procurement in the UK is now to address social sustainability. I don't know whether you're familiar with the ESG framework, but social sustainability is a great example of a fairly awful, indirect, euphemistic phraseology that basically means human rights. So now a further point to consider is that a company that is modern slavery diligent and can prove it, losing a tender to a company that is not potentially gives that losing company a civil cause of action against either the agency or the winning bidder. And I'll talk a little more about civil action a little later. But in any event, adding a simple 5 to 10 points for human rights due diligence to public procurement evaluation grids is potentially one of the easiest and most powerful hip pocket nerve ways of changing the way businesses do business, driving them to address human rights in their business and incentivizing them to address the elephant in the boardroom, which is their criminal liability for modern slavery in their business. I wanted to mention something that is almost never discussed, civil litigation. Now, I raise civil actions because they are not happening, but in fact they can and they should. Civil lawsuits are potentially a very effective demand-side measure. Now, to explain what civil litigation is for those who are not so familiar with it and how it differs from criminal cases, civil and criminal cases have something in common, which is the burden of proof. The burden of proof in both civil and criminal cases of producing the evidence required to prove the case falls to the one making the claim. And then the burden of proof lies with the party asserting an allegation of fact, and that's a principle of most legal systems. But the viability of civil actions comes about in talking about demand-side measures for human trafficking not because of the burden of proof, but because of the standard of proof. In criminal cases, the standard of proof, as we all know, is beyond a reasonable doubt. You've all heard the phrase. It's a very high standard. Coming from a police background, I can tell you it's super high. But in civil suits, the legal standard of proof is lower. It's on the balance of probabilities. Now, what that means is if the person bringing the lawsuit satisfies the balance of probabilities for all of the facts that need to be proven to make out the cause of action, they will probably win the case. And the even better news is that it perhaps only takes even just one case of modern slavery in a supply chain to form the basis for a civil action against the apex company, the company that ends up with buying that product through the supply chain. The Nikes and Amazons and so on. So this case essentially hinges on the basis of the claimant proving that the one case of modern slavery is probably true. If we could start to see civil suits of this sort against companies for modern slavery in their supply chains, suddenly the risk to companies takes a step up. And you heard Claire talk in the beginning about risk of detection and cost of detection. These are really two important characteristics. The cost of detection is something we can always increase. The risk of detection is something we generally can't afford to increase because it means more police, it means more this, more that. So civil suits against companies increases the risk to companies and it increases the cost to companies. And so that manifests in a company in a number of ways. And these ways really focus the minds of senior people in companies. The first thing is company directors suddenly need to be insured against liability for that civil action. Shareholders start demanding a higher standard to reduce their human rights risk. Investors start demanding the same for the risk reduction reasons. Lawyers need to be retained by companies at potentially enormous cost to fend off growing civil actions, because once one becomes successful, everybody will jump on. And considerable senior staff time at these big businesses is consumed defending civil actions. We all know how much time depositions take. And so very soon, very quickly, with this approach, the cost of not doing something about the problem of modern slavery in a company's supply chain outweighs the cost of doing something. So this is a bottom line demand side intervention, bringing civil actions against companies where you can prove at least one case of modern slavery. It will certainly demand corporate focus and incentivize better corporate behavior. Lastly, I would like to raise this. Civil litigation will reduce greenwashing, and that's because of a very simple concept, proof. Both criminal and civil actions demand that actual modern slavery due diligence be proved. They both require a corporate rebuttal of the claim of the case that was discovered in the supply chain. So in effect, they have to actually go through the steps of proving it didn't happen or that they did enough. To rule out recklessness, all reasonable measures must be taken and proved to have been taken. If all reasonable measures have been taken, but the case stands as proved in a civil action, the company's behavior was not intentional, but they could still be liable recklessly or negligently. Negligence, just to clear it up, has a lesser level of liability than recklessness. Negligence just involves acting in a careless manner, while recklessness involves a person taking a risk, a company taking a risk while knowing their actions may cause harm to another. So you see the principle, the level of proof and the standard is quite low. The upshot of this, in the case of civil actions for cases of modern slavery in a supply chain, the corporate talk alone will no longer suffice. It's exactly the way demand-side interventions should work. They become a source to incentivize positive change. Demanding proof, real proof, instead of press releases and glossy reports, that will bring substantive change to the way business operate in this, let's say, rapacious capitalist paradigm we operate in. Both of these demand-side approaches, public procurement and civil litigation, neither of which are difficult or complicated to start, are arrows in our quiver. We are very quickly a lot better armed to eradicate modern slavery from business. And we would be a darn sight better off than we are now. So thank you, Michelle, for the time.
To Brian, actually, a very interesting intervention. I can tell you that we appreciate yes, we definitely appreciate your expertise and your always original proposals, and including when you are speaking of demand-sided public procurement. And what I like is that indeed you've been constantly stressing the importance of demand side. And actually, I think we need actually to follow your example. What I'm wondering also is that your proposal for civil litigation, how the next speaker, how Professor Steiner will appreciate this. I think you are very convincing when you're speaking, but also I need also the appreciation of a legal expert. And also,
it's always great to have a judge's opinion.
Yes, it is. And then also what I thought, I liked that you were supporting Claire Potovesi of the importance of risk and cost factors. Indeed, yeah. Risk and cost factors are very important. Now, I have the honor of giving the floor to Professor Mark Steiner, an expert, a legal expert in public procurement. Mark, thank you very much for being with us. You have the floor.
For inviting me, Michelle. I think I owe this somehow to Brian Iselin, but I'm not really sure about. However, welcome everyone to that legal topic. It's about legal approaches to reducing the demand behind human trafficking, but with a special focus on public procurement. My, let's say, hypothesis is that public procurement can be seen as a blueprint for something like a conscious capitalism. This sounds at first glance perhaps a little bit naive, but I will give you the proof. Brian relies on proof, and so do I, that this is definitely, let's say, that we can observe a paradigm change in public procurement regulation, let's say during the last 10 years, we have seen so spectacular changes that this can be seen as like a nucleus for a new form of decent capitalism. That might be a little bit exaggerated at first glance, but you will hopefully be convinced that there lies a great opportunity after having heard what I have to say during the next quarter of an hour. Michel told me that perhaps we should give a general perspective on how to make the world a better place. I mean, for a Swiss, it's obvious that it's very important to make transparent and to ask big investors how money is invested. That's, for a Swiss perspective, obvious because we have a very important financial marketplace. So that would be a first lever, let's say, for a real change in economy. Second lever, in order to bring a real change to economy, is how to design development aid, how to design trade politics, trade contracts, trade treaties, trade regulation, including dispute settlement, WTO, you name it. That's the second thing. And the third and the fourth of these giant levers are supply chain related. So the one is supply chains of big enterprises. If we don't invest money, we buy stuff, and the sum of investments and buying is the economy. So supply chain of private firms and enterprises are the third lever, and the fourth is, that may be astonishing at first glance, but it's obvious considering the money being in it, public procurement. So if you want to change the world and you don't address public procurement, then I think you are not serious with what you're claiming. So the point is that to see how it came to the paradigm shift I'm trying to advocate, I will focus in the next minutes a little bit on legal history. I will tell you that we have been coming out of a neoliberal concept, and now we are replacing this neoliberal concept by a new vision of public supply chain management. This is true for the WTO Government Procurement Agreement. This is true for the European Union, the European Union Public Procurement Directives 2014. They are very progressive, very focused on sustainability, but there is not so much discussion about this because it's all is considered to be a technocrat's matter, and so the broad public is not interested what happens in public procurement. But this is a big, huge mistake. And the same is true also for Switzerland, because the new Swiss regime, the new law entered into force on federal level 1st of January 2021, so it's really new, makes the same as the European Union regulation, namely saying, hey guys, we want a new philosophy of the whole thing based on competition, based on quality, not competition based on price. We want to see innovation and we want to see sustainability. So the earlier neoliberal concept was market access, competition, money, and nothing else. And now we have the new keywords, competition based on quality, innovation, and sustainability. Sounds quite different, isn't it? But we go deeper into this. In order to understand what people can have as a possible mindset when discussing public procurement, I compare this with archaeological layers. When I was a young student at high school, I wanted to become an archaeologist, not a lawyer, not at all. And then the archaeologist in charge told me, before you start digging, Mark, you have to paint the layers. You have to paint what you see, describe them, give them a number in order afterwards have an order to explain people where you found which object in order to put it in a correct way afterwards in a museum, for instance. And that's the fascination of describing or painting archaeological layers. And what we are doing now is painting mindset layers on public procurement. What we were first in Switzerland were protectionists. We wanted to have a closed market, giving preference to local bidders, encouraging favoritism, protectionism, collusion of bidders was very frequent in Switzerland during the 80s of the last century. So the first layer can be described as protectionism, as anti-market access strategy. So it's clearly designed not to go for open markets. That's protectionism. In the 90s, the neoliberalism took over and wanted to destroy the layer one philosophy, abolish protectionism in favor of market access, competition, and money. And first Switzerland thought, we will do this all becoming a member of the European Economic Area, so the neoliberal concept would be bought automatically, be adhering to the European Economic Area. But this strategy failed. The Swiss people didn't want to be part of the European Economic Area. So Switzerland built its own neoliberal regulation of the 90s, including an internal market law for Switzerland to make more market access from canton to canton. Let's imagine how ridiculous this is from an international perspective. But anyhow, internal market law, cartel act on competition issues, then government procurement agreement WTO 1994, public procurement regulation, and all this together gave us a layer 2 understanding, neoliberal market access, competition, money, competition based on price, and nothing else, especially not sustainability. That's the layer 2 concept, clearly neoliberal, and that's where we are coming out from. And the high-rank WTO official told me once when we had dinner in Nottingham at the most famous conference in public procurement hosted by Professor Sue Arrowsmith, Mark, don't you agree that's a very strange world we are coming out of? And thereby he described this layer 2 thinking. And this shows you already that the WTO is meanwhile elsewhere and not anymore in the layer 2 concept. The new concept we are all in now, in Europe especially, is competition based on quality, sustainability, and innovation. This is encouraged by the WTO Government Procurement Agreement 2012, by the European Union Public Procurement Directives 2014, and of course also the new Swiss regulation on public procurement. So this is layer 3, and this shows you that there's a real paradigm shift. There are other keywords, a new understanding, a new vision, and a new mindset finally. So what does this mean? First, the WTO has moved, adopting the new Government Procurement Agreement 2012, saying, hey guys, earlier WTO instruments on procurement were seen as market access tools. That's still the truth, but not the only idea of the regulation. There are other ideas, such as fighting corruption, which normally is considered not to be a WTO topic. And what's even more important, it's also on governance and promoting development, of course, including sustainability issues. So the GPA 2012 Government Procurement Agreement makes a paradigm change from layer 2 to layer 3, saying, hey guys, the WTO is now open to a new mindset which focuses on quality, innovation, and sustainability. So this is the first great step forward. And the logical consequence of it is that they organized a symposium on sustainable procurement. This would have been unthinkable 10 years ago. Now it's absolutely a current issue to discuss sustainability issues in public procurement in a WTO context. It's really no problem. It's a huge change of mindset and understanding. The problem is no one speaks about it because it's such a special topic. It's a technocrat's business. It's complicated and it's not suited to discuss with the broad public. I don't agree, by the way. You can do this if you want. But that's the problem, that there's so much money in this. You can't possibly treat this topic as a technocrat's affair. If not, you are losing a wonderful tool to change the world. And no one would like to do that. Or am I mistaken? So, okay, WTO did a step forward. And the European Union, of course, was enthusiastic about this and said, okay, guys, if they go from layer 2 to layer 3, saying, hey, guys, the public procurement is a tool to achieve sustainability goals, then we will say the same. And that was the real change in Brussels. Thanks to the European Parliament, by the way, some other institutions were not quite fond of that, but the European Parliament has won the battle. Especially the Committee on Internal Market was very progressive, and they did it at the end, saying, hey guys, now the world is really different thanks to this new regulation. So WTO stepped forward, European Union stepped forward, including a mandatory exclusion ground in case of trafficking in human beings. And that's, yes, not by coincidence, the topic of today. And what's also included are ILO core labor standards, also as exclusion grounds. So it's clear that's not only a market access thing, but it's also about coherence with other policy goals than just competition, like sustainability. It's a more coherent vision of the whole legal system. And that's the idea of layer 3, more quality, more sustainability, more policy coherence, and more innovation. From a legal term, this is a more holistic view, and that's the only way of thinking for the future. I'm personally very convinced about that. Okay, we have seen now WTO made a step forward, European Union made a step forward. Now let's wait and see what happened in Switzerland. Switzerland has the habit of advocating at the highest level when it comes to the Department of Foreign Affairs how important the topic of human trafficking is. But if I ask those diplomats whether they involve the Ministry of Finance, where public procurement is done, or the Ministry of Economy, which hates social minimum standards basically because they are layer 2 people defending market access, competition, money, and nothing else, those people of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs tell me, no, we didn't have any contact with those departments or ministries. So I say, okay, so much about the seriousness of you having the thing high on the agenda. But that's not a topic. That could be another, let's say, discussion of 20 minutes, but I'll spare you that because it leads me a bit outside my focus explaining legal issues. So the point is that the new regulation on public procurement says in its Article 2 that sustainability is aim and purpose of the law. This is a spectacular change. No one would have expected that 10 years ago. It's the parliament making this thing possibly against the resistance of big business and the Association of the Economy in Switzerland called Economie Suisse. They hated, of course, this idea of having sustainability as aim and purpose, but the parliament with a majority defended sustainability as aim and purpose of the law. So that's really different. And the interesting thing is there's one tool guaranteeing social minimum standards. That's what you're interested in. ILO, core labor standard, forced labor, child labor, human trafficking. If that's not complied with, the bidder is excluded. That's the interesting stuff. And this implies also the right of a public procuring entity to go for audits abroad. It's explicitly mentioned in the law that the public authorities, when procuring, are allowed to go for audits wherever their supply chain is. And that's a really cool stuff, because there are some lawyers saying, hey, if you do audits abroad, this is a forbidden extraterritorial behavior. But I'm telling them, hey guys, when I buy something, I'm not regulating. And that's not extraterritorial because I behave like a merchant, and every merchant can ask for audits. So it's not a forbidden extraterritorial behavior if I, as a public entity, ask for an audit. And that's great. That's now the absolutely majority view on the topic, which is an obvious paradigm change. The next thing is that it's not only about minimum standards, but also on competition based on quality. The price is less important than according to the earlier regulation. The new regulation says the more advantageous tender wins the award, which means that's a quality matter and not a question of price. And that's a really cool move, because this gives a new understanding on what the whole thing is about. Interestingly enough, as well as in Europe, as well as in Switzerland, you can give extra points for fair trade. So let's say if you buy fair trade coffee, then you do more than just prevent slavery and child labor. You give extra point for extra goodies, for an extra social friendly supply chain. And this you can reward within the award criteria. So you can put sustainability as an award criterion and give extra points if you have, for instance, fair trade coffee offered. And that's really cool, because this makes another system change, because according to the old regulation in Switzerland on public procurement, this was forbidden because lack of legal basis, and now it's explicitly allowed, and now you can give extra points for fair trade issues and outweigh a higher price, and that's really cool. So the minimum standards combined with extra point for fair trade makes the world change. That's the idea of the new public procurement regulation. Conclusion: there can be clearly found a paradigm change when it comes to the modern way of regulating public procurement, be it in the WTO, be it in the European Union, be it in Switzerland, since the 1st January of 2021. This means that the neoliberal mindset layer 2, as described within this archaeological layers let's say, picture in a broad term, the mindset layer 2 consisting of market access, competition based on price, money and nothing else, is recently overlaid by a mindset layer 3, competition based on quality, sustainability and innovation. And the interesting thing is that if you ask from a private enterprise to buy sustainably, this could be a problem. But if you ask from a public entity, that's clear that he has to buy decently, because every constitution in Europe tells public entities to foster sustainable development, which you can only do if you buy sustainably. So it's a matter of policy coherence to commit yourself as a public entity on a layer 3 concept, competition based on quality, sustainability, innovation. This can make out of public procurement a blueprint for a conscious capitalism, especially concerning supply chain, because if the world gets aware that public buying can do this, that public supply chains can be cleaner, then they will ask the same also from private supply chains. And that's a benchmarking effect. And if we achieve this, then the world really looks different. Thank you so much for your kind attention.
Thank you so much, Judge Steiner. Thank you so much, Mark, for this comprehensive and very lively and convincing intervention. Thanks also for your proposals for making the world a better place in investing, in designing development aid, in regulating public procurement at a Swiss, European, and international level. And now, I would say I'm very happy to give the floor. That's a video recording because he is in Australia, and with the time difference, it would be difficult for him to be live with us. But I can tell you it's a very interesting intervention of another Australian pioneer in combating human trafficking, John Mccarty, Queen's Counsel, who is the founder and moving force of a quite interesting initiative in Australia. And now let's listen to and let's watch John Mccarty.
I welcome the invitation to address this important webinar. I thank Michelle Vuthi for this invitation on behalf of the webinar sponsors. The entire series has been an important international contribution to knowledge and analysis in respect of modern slavery and human trafficking. An objective of this webinar is to explore and consider responses to modern slavery and human trafficking by institutions and agencies that procure goods and services for use, not for further sale. The cost of goods and services involved in such procurement represents a measure of demand of the procurer for the goods and services from particular sources are the supply. That's a roundabout way of saying the context I'm addressing is not one of reselling or on-selling or acting as a broker or middleman. Processes and procedures for procurement of goods and services not being tainted with modern slavery, including human trafficking and forced labour, is to eliminate or reduce the demands for goods and services so tainted and thereby exclude exploiter suppliers. If such arrangements include many procurers in either the public or private sector, the whole market for goods and services tainted with modern slavery is rapidly undermined. Catholic institutions and agencies in countries such as Australia are classic demand procurers of goods and services for their mission, whether health, education, or welfare. Their change patterns of procurement, excluding slavery-tainted goods and services, can influence regional and national suppliers not desiring to be excluded from these contracts. Such supplier response would be accentuated by public authorities adopting similar policies. In 2018, the Global Slavery Index estimated that 40.3 million people were experiencing modern slavery, including an estimated 15,000 people in Australia. It is also estimated that 16 million of these people are trapped in the supply chains of private companies producing goods and services for the global market. It is likely that most of us have purchased electronics, such as mobile phones and computers, food, such as tea or coffee, chocolate, frozen fish, textiles, such as clothing, shoes, linens, or other items, such as furniture, jewellery, makeup, made by people enslaved in factories, illegal fisheries, forests, on farms, and in mines, to name a few. The Catholic Church, in order to carry out its mission through its agencies and institutions, must be a procurer of goods and services. In Australia, Catholic leadership is at the forefront of campaigns to exclude slavery-tainted goods and services from procurement in the Australian economy. This is the example generated by the policies and practices of Catholic agencies and institutions in Australia. An important purpose is that Catholic anti-slavery practice may come to influence Australian civil authorities and corporate leaders. The presence of modern slavery is a sombre and difficult challenge for any organisation to address, whether a nation state, a global corporation, or the universal church. More people are trapped in modern slavery than at any time in history. Today, the risk that a product or service is tainted with slave labour somewhere in the supply chains occurs in almost all industries, and all countries are affected. So too are the supply chains of Catholic entities in Australia. The profits alone from human trafficking and modern slavery circulating the global economy are estimated to be in excess of US dollars 150 billion. The Holy Father, Pope Francis, has referred to this astounding figure as blood money. Law enforcement across every jurisdiction struggles to have significant effect on these criminal activities. If the primary focus of enforcement continues and remains on prosecutions, it will be impossible to reach the SDG 8.7 target before the next century, let alone 2030. That is the challenge. Yet we believe and have faith that we can make a difference. I speak today to the experience of the Church and its institutions in Australia in relation to modern slavery and human trafficking. What I want to describe to you is the particular pathway in Australia which has led us to a national network of Catholic agencies, dioceses and personnel working together to eradicate modern slavery from our operations and supply chains. This Catholic Australian experience can, I hope, inform and encourage you on your pathway as Catholics all over the world move towards our Holy Father's objective of eradicating modern slavery in our generation. Indeed, our journey in Australia begins with the inspiration of the Holy Father, who had a major role in the United Nations Sustainable Development Goal 8.7 to eradicate forced labour, modern slavery, human trafficking and child labour by 2030. Pope Francis has emphasised that buying goods is not just a commercial matter. Our purchasing habits have deep moral dimensions. As the largest employer in Australia outside the public sector, the Catholic Church is in a pivotal position to lead the momentum for change on this critical issue. 5.1 million people across Australia identify as Catholics. Schools, hospitals, residential aged care facilities, universities, investment and insurance funds are just some of the Catholic institutions that touch the lives of millions of Australians, regardless of faith. 1 in 5 Australian school children are educated in Catholic schools. 1 in 10 hospital patients and aged care residents receive care in Catholic health facilities. The extent of Catholic supply chains is therefore highly significant. Indeed, the major exposure to modern slavery by the Church in Australia is related to procurement decisions, to the buying of goods and services and investments. Today, I'm pleased to say that entities representing 70% of Catholic activity in Australia, having joined in the collaborative exercise we call ACAN, the Australian Catholic Anti-Slavery Network. These Catholic institutions have begun programs and work to become more slavery-free every year between now and 2030. We know an enormous effort will be required to achieve these goals. Catholic institutions are working together and taking the lead. We are calling on Australians and Australian institutions to come with us so that together we can eradicate modern slavery in our own country. Eradication has been a persistent and consistent message of Pope Francis since his election to the chair of St. Peter in 2013. It is a message directed as much to church leaders as it is to national leaders and civil authorities. In proposing action in the Sydney Archdiocese, Archbishop Anthony Fisher has stated, "It is not enough for groups such as churches to lecture or exhort the rest of the community in such matters. We must demonstrate our own willingness to act where we can." Archbishop Fisher subsequently appointed an anti-slavery task force, of which I am the chair, and issued us with a strong mandate to establish a roadmap to eradicate modern slavery and human trafficking from the operations and supply chains of the Sydney Archdiocese. We gave our first report to the Archbishop in January 2018. And on St. Bakita's Day, 8th of February 2018, Archbishop Fisher publicly announced that he had accepted the recommendations of the task force. This far-reaching framework, which is now being implemented widely amongst Australian Catholic entities, seeks to bring about change in the areas where the Church has the most capacity to influence change in our own operations and supply chains. The task force executive has developed and is implementing a risk management program for Catholic entities. The task force has also worked closely with governments and legislators with the view to ensuring that legislation and public procurement policy includes human rights due diligence throughout supply chains. In 2018, our work received a major boost when Australia's Modern Slavery Act came into force. This Act was developed through extensive consultations, including the Australian business community and civil society, including the Catholic Church. Some key points of the Australian legislation are: it applies to at least 3,000 entities, including foreign entities. It applies to an entity with annual consolidated revenue of at least US $75 million. It applies to Australian government procurement. It applies to not-for-profit organisations such as churches and universities. The Modern Slavery Act also applies to Catholic Church entities. In response to the mandatory reporting requirements, the task force convened a national conference in July 2019 on eradicating slavery from Catholic operations and supply chains. It was this conference that recommended the establishment of the Australian Catholic Anti-Slavery Network, ACAN. ACAN's activities, coordinated by the Anti-Slavery Task Force, have become the embodiment of Catholic commitment to eradicating modern slavery risk from Catholic operations and supply chains in Australia. One of the very important aspects of ACAN is that it is a forum for Catholic entities to work collaboratively, sharing knowledge and building capacity among their designated modern slavery liaison officers. Together, ACAN participants are taking practical and direct action to address modern slavery risks in operations and supply chains. The scale is significant. As I mentioned, Catholic entities represent 70% of Catholic activity, an annual consolidated revenue of over Australian dollars 23 billion, with expenditure on goods and services, not salaries, of over $6 billion Australian. Together, we analysed that revenue through a risk management program, and areas of risk and high spend were identified and categorised. Collectively, as purchasers of goods and services, Catholic entities have committed to work with suppliers to improve labour practices in Australia. The high-risk areas for ACAN entities are construction and medical supplies. ACAN's risk management program, shared among the 40 participating entities, involves policy, supplier contract clauses, training for staff and suppliers, as well as 30 different templates, tools, and resources. All of the resources are shared via the ACAN website, in monthly webinars, and in regular communications. Australian legislation requires reporting entities to specify remediation programs and processes they are following in relation to incidents and victims of modern slavery. ACAN has responded to this requirement by launching a program called DOMUS 8.7, a comprehensive one-stop shop and confidential advice service for church, community and business to access expertise, as well as socio-legal support services for victims. This has been a short overview of the work we are doing in a very busy space for the purpose of reducing and redirecting demand for goods and services so that Catholic procurement is not of goods tainted with modern slavery. The Catholic Church in Australia is at the forefront of programs and efforts to eradicate modern slavery in our generation, which is so much desired by Pope Francis. Australian Catholics fervently pray that their work and programs will influence the wider church and the wider world as pathways to eradicating modern slavery. We also strongly believe that our work and programs are Catholic social teaching in action. I congratulate Michel Vuithy and his distinguished sponsors for their presentation of this webinar series, which is of high quality and enduring importance. The anti-slavery cause worldwide is indebted to all of you.
Thanks a million for sharing this unique experience, and thanks also to Alison Rahil, your assistant, and your team for this excellent visual presentation. As everyone could have seen, you can reach John Mccarty by email on the website of ACAN or also on the website of the Archdiocese of Sydney. Actually, we could now welcome questions in the Q&A section of this webinar. Allow me to read one. It's coming from Canada, and that's a survivor who say, can you email provide the main website link with all the upcoming human trafficking webinars your organization provides? I can tell you, yes, I will. Your speakers are very informative and progressive. If you would like to network with them directly to advertise your webinars, please contact them and give an email address, nthtnetworkcanada@gmail.com. Then definitely, as you've seen on our chat and Q&A, actually you have the Ad Laudato Si website. You have also christusliberat.org website, and all of those could be definitely quite interesting. And actually, as we have no other question, or possibly some other question could come, I would be happy to give the floor again to Brian Islin and Judge Mark Steiner for additional reflections on this very important issue. Brian, I'm feeling that you are ready to shoot, no? Good.
Always ready to shoot, Michelle.
Yeah.
So one of the things I wanted to comment on was so with my project at Slave Free Trade, one of the things we're trying to do is introduce what I call a third track in communications between businesses and supply chains. So what we've had up until now from the 60s is supply chains are made up of disaggregated supply chain actors, companies buying and selling from each other. Now there are two tracks to that dialogue. One track is price, the other track is quality. So this is a different quality that I'm talking about than to what Mark was talking about in public procurement law. The quality in this case is about a certain number of kilos of coffee beans at a certain grade and refined to a certain degree. So these quality characteristics are all about the product. So what we've seen since the 60s and arguably the 70s actually, with this the manifestation, the spreading of global supply chains, is that these actors only talk to each other about these two characteristics. And as soon as the conversation changes to add anything else to the conversation, it shuts down. So if you ask any small business, for example, my cousin was setting up a drop shipping company at one point, a fashion business. And so she needed to connect with suppliers who could provide quickly. And her experience with companies in the supply chain for handbags and belts and dresses and so on was exactly the same as everybody else's experience, which is that they get to their first level supplier, they ask about characteristics of quality and price, and they understand that. And then as soon as they ask any questions about the ethicality or sustainability of these products, they get shut down. They hit a blank wall. The suppliers aren't providing it. So one of the really interesting things with what we're trying to do with Slave Free Trade is we connect each workplace in a supply chain by virtue of their human rights performance. So let's talk about a three-tier supply chain. A chocolatier goes to their supplier is a cocoa processor, their supplier is a plantation, so a classic three-tier supply chain. And in that supply chain, each of the workplaces in that chain gets a human rights performance score. And those scores are connected, those workplaces are connected, so that the chain score means the chocolate bar at the retail end can't go on the shelf unless each of the human rights workplace is human rights compliant. Now, our hypothesis in putting all of this together was that we would be introducing this third track, that suddenly that we felt that these companies would actually start then to talk about human rights if we connected them this way, because they become dependent on each other's human rights performance. In our pilot, the cocoa supply chain that I mentioned, it worked out exactly like that. These disaggregated supply chain actors started talking about price, continued talking about price and quality, and added human rights to their conversation. It became the third track. And in some ways, it actually became compelling for them, because the staff in the first workplace at the top of the supply chain, suddenly actually they became interested, not just on a purchasing level, they became interested in the workplace conditions in the plantation at tier 3, where they had no visibility whatsoever before. So it's really exciting to see these disaggregated supply chain actors turning into collaborative networked organizations because of the addition of human rights communication and understanding. So I wanted to say that.
Can I add to this a sentence?
Of course.
Now, this is the really interesting point where we get to the breakthrough in Switzerland, because at the beginning it was the same thing. Outside of traditional quality issues, no communication at all. And then we had army combat boots procurement from the defense ministry. And some journalists found out where they were produced and under which conditions. And they were a disaster. And so the journalist went back in Switzerland and told the Ministry of Defense, do you really want to be responsible for those conditions? And then the Ministry of Defense told them, we are not responsible, ask the Ministry of Finance. And the Ministry of Finance told them, we are not responsible, ask the Ministry of Defense. And so the journalist cut those two statements together, and the broad public of Swiss TV had a great laugh. everyone found this so amusing that the kind of communication of official, this was really, let's say, devastating in the proper sense of the term. And so since then, they have got the message that being more ambitious when going for social standards in public procurement is a reputational risk management issue. And so this is the way to make them understand that quality means today more than it meant 50 years ago, perhaps. But sorry for intervening. It's your floor, Brian.
No, you're supposed to be intervening. It's a discussion, Mark, and I welcome it. I would also ask for your comment on one of the other points, which was that you were talking in the Swiss laws about, you used the word sustainability quite a lot. Now, one of the interesting things that I've found with slave free trade is that whenever we talk sustainability with businesses or consumers, most of them don't include in sustainability ethicality. They don't include human rights. So when they talk sustainability, it's all green, which is why we have the term greenwashing, whether it refers to human rights or the environment. So the definition of sustainability, one of the things on my agenda is to broaden the definition. Sustainability has got to include the human. And if you think about it from an ESG perspective, environment, social governance, the S is the poor cousin. It's the one never talked about at the table. It's like the cousin nobody wants, the uncle, nobody wants to invite to the wedding. So social sustainability is the one that never gets talked about. So I would love to get your thoughts about what we might do to broaden the definition or the understanding of sustainability, not just in public perspective, but even within companies.
Oh, yes, this is a really huge topic. I can give you an answer perhaps based on the European Union directive. So there were two reforms in Europe. 2004 was a reform more or less limited on green public procurement because social aspects were very disputed. And 2014, when the next reform came, it was crystal clear that sustainability means economics, environment, and social aspects in a European public procurement understanding. And since then, this is undisputed also inside the WTO and Switzerland, because the European model made it really clear that this cannot be seen only green sustainability concept is absolutely, it's deprived of its meaning. It makes no sense. And what is interesting that we can now see what happens in America. When you look after COVID-19, Corona, you see that Joe Biden announces a Build Back Better program. This is a kind of a comparable concept as a Green New Deal would be in Europe. And the problem is that the Americans, they are now where the Europeans have been 2004, seeing sustainability only as a green thing without implying ethical issues and social minimum standards. So we have to explain the US what happened in Europe in order to make them understand that they are going exactly the same way just 10 years later.
No, thank you very much, Mark. Actually, there are two things. First, I think we need to see that integral ecology in the meaning of the Laudato Si encyclical is very much in this direction, including the human in the environment. Second, I must say we have now also a question, and this question is I don't know. You could possibly both try to answer it, but I would possibly ask first, Brian. Is there any company that has a good track record so that it can be held up to others as a good example? When we began the fair trade movement, one of the ways we go to the products into mainstream supermarkets was to give examples of those who embrace fair trade. Now notice fewer fair trade products in the supermarket. Can we build on a fair trade model? I don't know. Could you possibly both try to answer this question?
Sure. Can I go first, Mark? Can I go first, Mark? Yes. Okay. Good. So build on fair trade model. I do want to answer the question directly, but I'll also try and hedge and get around it a bit. But can we build on the fair trade model? I think we have to recognize that fair trade has pretty much peaked. And one of the reasons for that, there are lots of reasons, but one of the reasons for that is that equal profit doesn't resonate emotionally with people anymore. It was a big thing in the 70s, big thing in the 80s. It's no longer there. People don't resonate with equal profit. So you get people going into a supermarket, looking at two chocolates. One is a fair trade chocolate. They see there's a $1.70 difference because of the premium on fair trade products. 61% of which goes to the retailer, by the way. So it's interesting that people just don't feel strongly about fair trade anymore. And many people will not pay the $1.70 and they'll put it back. Supermarkets know that, which is why they're now carrying less fair trade products. And in some supermarket cases, they've dropped fair trade products completely because consumers just won't pay the premium anymore. So that's an interesting thing to consider. Another thing to consider is that fair trade is not a human rights standard. Fair trade has some characteristics around child labor, for example, as part of their framework, but they're not a human rights standard. They don't address a comprehensive range of human rights in workplaces. The other thing to consider is that they're a function of the old and, let's say, very strongly outmoded model of certification and audit. So that means that they put a label. Certification and audit is where you put a label on something on the basis of an infrequent audit where people actually go out to a workplace and have a look in a very small percentage of supply chains and workplaces, and not even every year, every 3 years, for example. So certification and audit has been shown to be wanting in a failed model. The one-dimensional label that goes on a product in the shelves in supermarkets for all the labels, not just fair trade, but B Corp, Fair Wear, Better Cotton Initiative, they've all been shown to be really, really wanting when it comes to the proof of the pudding. So fair trade, we can learn from what fair trade did by mobilizing consumers with a label on products. They were one of the first social labels since abolition. And that's a very important thing that they did. They showed that you can move markets by moving consumers, which is a really important precedent. But unfortunately, when it comes to human rights, I just don't find them very relevant for people anymore. I speak to people about it all the time, every day, and most people just think it's plateaued. We can definitely learn from them. We can definitely canvass and corral demand at the consumer level, and that consumer demand. Let me just tell a quick story. Sorry, Mark, I'm taking the floor, but just want to tell a quick story. So 20 years ago, one of my first cases was a forced labor case, which was also a child labor and human trafficking case, as it turned out. 12-year-old boy shot in the head, dumped overboard from a prawn boat. Now, one of the very interesting things was that he was a 12-year-old child. He was child labor, he was human trafficking, and he was forced labor. And none of those definitions that we hold so dear to us at the national and international level meant a damn thing to him. None of them reflected what his needs were. None of them. So that was one of the first lessons I learned. But one of the other lessons was that the prawns that came from those boats ended up in supermarket freezers right across Europe. And I just put myself in that position 20 years ago, thinking at that time about a Parisian shopper standing in front of a supermarket freezer, Carrefour in Paris, for example, looking at the frozen prawns. They had absolutely no way of knowing what's going on behind those prawns. However, if we can put on the prawns that have been caught the right way, with human rights standards applied and provable in real time, we can make that single shopper change their buying decision in 0.75 of a second. That buying preference multiplied millions of times sends a tsunami down the value chain. And that sends the message that preferential buying will be directed towards those companies that can prove human rights compliance in their workplaces. And then everybody down the value chain has to respond, including retailers. The consumers send a loud message to retailers when they take those actions. This is what we can learn. And this is what slave-free trade is all about.
Mark, you have something to add, certainly? Yeah.
Yes, the problem is that also when it comes to social minimum standards, we cannot avoid labels and certificates. For instance, what's very common in supply chain context is the label SA8000 to make sure that some social minimum standards are kept. So the idea of being able to do business in supply chain without labels and certificate would perhaps little bit naive. What is true is that we need to do more than this. And that's where Brian and I think easily agree. So this just to give you an additional information, because without labels and certificates, supply chain management will already, because of a transaction costs logics in an economic understanding, never work.
Okay. Brian, an additional comment? Or?
No, I agree with Mark.
Okay, that's good. That's good. But we know, and actually, I would like to thank you for bringing Mark to this webinar, because thanks to you, we could, we are both Swiss and both based in Switzerland, but we needed you, an Australian friend, to bring us together. So,
well, I'm also made in Switzerland, right? I mean, my family is 600 years in Glarus canton. So.
No, it did. No, that's very good. Actually, I had no more questions, just people asking me why we did not deal with sexual exploitation. I can say that it was on purpose, because we could actually do that. We did that in past.
We have done that. Yeah.
We have done that. We will do most probably in the future. But please visit adloud.ac.org and see the past webinars, and you'll see that there were quite interesting interventions, both on the trauma, both on the treatment, both on the criminal prosecution. And I see, Brian, that you want to add something. Please do.
I just see a question there about, is the UN human rights compliant? Absolutely not. Absolutely not. Guaranteed. They are covered in slavery.
Okay, I will just say that.
And I hope someone from the UN will respond.
Yeah. No. I would just like to say that indeed you had very good special rapporteurs, when now you have Professor Obokata from Japan and based and teaching in the UK. You have also other special rapporteurs like Professor Moulali. She's a professor in Ireland. We had Judge Maria Grazia John Marinaro from Italy. I must say all those people, and I can also name a few others, including a judge from South Africa. I must say all those were indeed publishing quite interesting things. But I agree with you, Brian, that next to those interesting reports, I don't know what the end effect was, and
they would all readily admit that the UN is just covered in slavery. They buy and sell. Their procurement procedures are no different to any other public procurement institution in the system. But one of the things I wanted to say was that public procurement I think we get this sense, I think people get a sense that public procurement is this big institutional question, right? How do you move public procurement? But in fact, one of the things is to look below the surface of that to the people in the organization. I spoke at the National Procurement Institute conference in the US 2 years ago. Now, this is the national body for municipalities and counties across the United States, so thousands of members. when you sit down and talk to each of the category managers, purchasing managers, and so on at each of these institutions, one of the things that hits you immediately is that there's not a single one of them that wants to be buying slavery. Not one. So those public procurement institutions are not a response to the values of the individuals behind the desks. If those individuals have a choice, it's just like the Parisian shopper with the prawns in front of them. It would take them minutes, less than minutes, to decide on a slavery-free procurement compared to the other tenders that are not. The human behind them is so important. What are their drivers?
Then I would like possibly to just add a few words, but at the end of this webinar, and I would like to thank all speakers and participants